He wasn't human. He didn't have a soul. And I would have burned the world down for him anyway. A dark romance. Content warning. This story contains dark romance themes, extreme power imbalance, contempt as a form of attraction, real physical danger, and the deeply unsettling contradiction between what your brain tells you to do and what your gut refuses to stop wanting. This is not a story about healthy love. It's a story about real love, which, more often than we'd like to admit, isn't healthy at all. Real love tends to find us exactly where we least want to be found, in the darkest, most contradictory, most uncomfortably honest corner of ourselves. If you keep reading, keep your eyes open. The main character did. She knew exactly what she was walking into. She walked in anyway. The woman who studied monsters. I spent years studying creatures that were supposed to terrify people. I never thought the terror itself would be what made me feel most alive. Lara Voss, expert in keeping her distance. Lara Voss was 27 years old and had a theory about herself that she'd spent a long time developing. One she was, honestly, pretty proud of for being accurate. She had been built for distance. Not the geographic kind, though she had that covered too. She'd lived in 6 countries before she turned 25, spoke 4 languages fluently, and 2 more well enough to do field research. The distance she was really good at was something else, the kind that settles in between a person and the rest of the world when that person learns, too early and too permanently, that the world doesn't handle the soft parts of you with any particular care. She had brown hair that almost never came out of a bun, wireframe glasses she wore more as a shield than a necessity, and a way of moving through rooms that everyone around her described, in one way or another, as contained. Like she'd calculated exactly how much of herself was safe to let out in any given situation, and never gave 1 millimeter more than that. She was a researcher of folklore and ancient mythology at the University of Vienna, with 5 peer-reviewed articles published before she turned 27. 3 of them were about pre-Christian entities from the Balkans, and what role they played in medieval communities. 1 was about the group psychology of fear in isolated medieval villages. And 1, the most cited of her career, the one that got her the most conference invitations and the most hostile emails from colleagues who clearly didn't know what to do with the argument, was about the erotic function of the monster in medieval women's imaginations. She'd written that last one at 3 in the morning after 2 glasses of red wine, and the kind of honesty that only shows up when nobody's watching. The central argument, the monster in medieval women's literature and artwork, wasn't simply the danger to be avoided. It was often the only space where a woman could project a desire that didn't fit into any socially acceptable category, the desire to be truly seen, to matter, to provoke a reaction that was visceral and total instead of managed and convenient. The monster wanted her back without asking permission. And that, Lara argued with the cool, clinical detachment of someone describing other people's psychology, was precisely what made the monster irresistible. She submitted the article without rereading it. The next morning, sober, she spent 3 hours hovering her cursor over the withdrawal button before deciding to let it stand. 3 years later, it was the most cited thing she'd ever written. What she never included in the article, what she would never put in anything meant for other people to read, was where the argument actually came from. Thomas. 2 years of a relationship that felt real right up until the afternoon she showed up at his apartment unannounced and found someone else there instead of her. There was no scene. No drama worthy of the damage. He just looked at her with this specific expression of relief, the look of someone who got caught before they had to do something hard, and said maybe this was for the best. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was how ordinary it was. The complete absence of anything grand, of a well-constructed lie, of any evidence that what they'd had was worth the effort of destroying properly. After that, Lara built her life with the precision of someone designing a system that couldn't fail. One plant in the apartment because plants don't betray you, but they also don't ask anything of you. An airtight routine that started at 6 a.m. and contained zero surprises. Friendships maintained at a comfortable temperature, built on shared intellectual interests rather than actual vulnerability. And the monsters. Always the monsters. She studied them because she believed, genuinely believed, or at least convinced herself she did, that a catalogued danger is the only kind of danger you can actually handle. Name the beast and you've tamed it. Describe it in academic terms, place it in historical context, analyze its psychological function. All of that built a wall of distance between her and the subject of study that she called safety. She had no idea she was about to meet something that would laugh, if it knew how to laugh, at the very concept of being tamed. Something that wouldn't just reject the wall she'd built, but would use that wall against her in a way she never saw coming. Something that would weaponize contempt like gravity. The job offer and everything they didn't mention. The email arrived on a Tuesday in September, when Vienna was at the exact right temperature for staying home with tea and a 14th century manuscript. It was from Dr. Emmerich Brandt, director of the Institute for Archaeology and Cultural Heritage, and it had the overly casual tone of someone about to ask for something they know is going to be complicated. The offer: travel to the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, specifically to a village called Vârful Negru in the Bistritnazor district, to catalogue a recently discovered collection of manuscripts in an abandoned monastery on the mountain above the village. The documents dated from the 12th through 14th centuries and apparently described, based on a preliminary spectroscopy analysis, rituals for summoning and containing pre-Christian entities from the Wallachian tradition. Exactly the kind of material that was Lara's specialty. She replied in 2 minutes. What the email didn't mention, because Brandt genuinely didn't know, was the real story behind the discovery. Those manuscripts hadn't been found by archaeologists. They'd been found scattered across the floor of a chamber by a shepherd who'd gone into the building looking for a lost sheep and come out running, without the sheep, without the documents, and wearing an expression his wife would describe to anyone who'd listen as the face of a man who saw what lives on the wrong side of the world. The sheep was never found. The monastery hadn't simply been abandoned. It had been sealed, 900 years of careful monastic work, 7 layers of symbols carved into limestone by monks who spent decades of their lives on the ritual and died, most of them, without seeing it finished. The seal had held through time, humidity, Carpathian winters, and something the villagers described in low voices as the weight of what's inside, trying to get out. It had broken 3 weeks before Brandt's email. Lara arrived in Vârful Negru 15 days later, completely unaware of any of this, her heart beating fast with the academic excitement of someone about to touch 12th century material for the first time. Vârful Negru and the woman who already knew. The village was the kind of place that looked like it had given up on the future without exactly giving up on the present. Stone houses with dark slate roofs, gardens still tended but without much enthusiasm, a central square with a dry fountain nobody had gotten around to fixing. And old people, only old people visible, as if the village had collectively decided at some point not too long ago to stop producing new generations. Nobody looked at Lara when she parked. Not the subtle glance away of people who are curious but pretending not to be. The deliberate not looking of people who'd decided not looking was safer. The guest house owner, Marta Ionescu, was a woman in her 60s with white hair and eyes that took in everything at once without making a production of it. She met Lara at the door with a dry nod and led her to the room without small talk. Simple, clean, a window facing the square and, beyond it, the mountain. The mountain dominated the view in a way Lara only fully registered when she was alone in the room. It wasn't the biggest mountain she'd ever seen, the Alps would have laughed at it. But there was something about how it imposed itself on the eye, how it made everything else in the landscape feel like background detail arranged around a central presence. Near the top, visible through the low October mist, was the dark stone outline of the monastery. Lara stared at it longer than she'd planned. Dinner was served in silence. Lara tried to make conversation. "The monastery is up on the mountain. Do you know the path?" Marta set her soup spoon down and looked at Lara, with an expression that Lara would spend days trying to name correctly. "Everyone knows the path," Marta said. "Nobody goes up." "Why not?" A long pause. "The kind that weighs the question before it weighs the answer." "Because there's nothing up there worth what the climb costs you," Marta said. And went back to eating. It was a carefully constructed non-answer, and Lara recognized it as one. She made a mental note: local superstition. Common in isolated regions. Investigate historical context. What she didn't note, because she didn't have a category for it yet, was the detail she caught as she was pushing back from the table. Marta was staring at the window. At the mountain. With an expression that Lara would take weeks to correctly identify. It wasn't fear. It was the opposite of fear, the face of someone who had already passed through fear and come out the other side, into the territory where fear loses its power, because what you were afraid of has either already happened, or is inevitable, or both. It was the face of someone who knew. That night, Lara heard Marta close the hallway shutters with a firmness that felt more like ritual than habit. Closing that specific window, facing that specific direction, every single night, regardless of the weather. Lara slept with her own window open, facing the mountain. It wasn't an accident. It was the first of many choices she would make, knowing, on some level deeper than she wanted to admit, that she was choosing the monastery and what was inside it. She hiked up alone the next morning, loaded with a high-resolution camera, 2 research notebooks, thin-handling gloves, and the contained excitement of someone who'd spent years studying a type of material and was about to touch it for the first time. The path was a stretch of wet stone that zigzagged up the slope and periodically disappeared under layers of decomposed leaves. Birds sang below a certain altitude. Then they stopped. Not gradually, one moment there was sound, the next there wasn't, like someone hitting mute. Lara stopped. Listened to the silence. Then kept going. The monastery came out of the mist the way something appears in a memory, not quite like it materialized, more like it had always been there, and was only now deciding to let itself be seen. Black walls of moss-eaten stone, a square tower leaning slightly east in a way that bothered the eye without her being able to pinpoint exactly why. The geometry was almost right. And almost right is so much more unsettling than flat-out wrong. The front door was open. Not broken in. Not rotted through. Open, the way someone leaves a door when they go out and don't plan on coming back, or when they know the lock isn't going to matter anymore. Lara walked in. The inside was in improbably good shape for a building that had been sealed for centuries. The frescoes on the walls were darkened by time, but still readable, and Lara stopped in front of them with her breath catching in her throat. She recognized some of the figures, entities described in apocryphal texts she'd studied, forms that showed up in the margins of Carolingian manuscripts more as warnings than illustrations. But most of the figures were older than any tradition she'd catalogued. From a time before the categories of sacred and profane, good and evil, had even been invented. One figure appeared in almost every fresco. Tall, with proportions that were only superficially human, always at the center with smaller shapes arranged around it, not in worship, exactly. More like the natural organization of things that orbit a greater mass. The face had been rendered as a flat, dark surface, like a mirror with no reflection. No expression, because expression was a category that didn't apply. Lara photographed everything. Steady hands, racing heart, excitement she told herself was purely academic. Then she found the chamber. At the back of the monastery, through a dark hallway where she needed her phone flashlight, there was a stone door unlike the others, framed by dense carvings, symbols layered on top of each other, some so old the stone itself seemed to have been shaped around them. A door designed to be the final barrier for something. The stone was cold to the touch, much colder than the air temperature should have made it, and there was a vibration in it that lived below the threshold of hearing. She felt it in her teeth and at the base of her spine. The door gave on the first push. The chamber was circular, with the ceiling open in a narrow crack that let in a pale strip of light illuminating the stone floor evenly. At the center was a containment circle layered symbols carved with a precision that implied decades of work. The circle was intact. But there was a shadow at the center that shouldn't have existed. Nothing to cast it. No source. Dense, solid, completely still in the way that shadows aren't. Lara stopped. The shadow moved. What came out of the shadow? He didn't look at me like a threat. He looked at me like I was irrelevant. That was so much worse than anything I'd been afraid of. Kale and the first contempt. The form that came out of the shadow had the surface structure of a man and the substance of something else entirely. Tall, close to 6'5", maybe more. A masculine silhouette, but with something systematically off about the geometry, the way a translation loses something essential between languages. Shoulders broad in a way that was structural, not muscular. Arms with a length that pushed the edge of human proportion. The neck connected to the head in a way that was just slightly wrong from standard anatomy. Black hair that wasn't just dark, but seemed to absorb the light around it, creating density where there should have been reflection. Skin an antecedent white, not pallor, not sickness, but the color of something that existed before it needed color. Like stone before it's been carved. And the eyes, dark gray, almost black, and completely empty of anything she could recognize as human presence. No cruelty in them. No curiosity. Not even the minimum warmth of someone who registers another living being as relevant. Just attention. The attention of a measuring instrument. Precise, total, and completely indifferent to what it measured. He looked her up and down with that inventory check attention, and his expression. If you could call it an expression. Was that of someone verifying the contents of a box they weren't expecting much from. Then he said, in a low, flat voice. You broke the seal. Not as an accusation. As a data point. I didn't break anything, Lara said. The seal was already broken when I got here. A pause. He tilted his head slightly. Not a gesture of consideration, more like a camera adjusting its angle. So you came in anyway, he said. I'm a researcher. What came next was worse than any threatening reaction she'd imagined, because it wasn't a reaction at all. He just kept looking at her with that inventory expression, and then said. Human. Researcher. A pause. Irrelevant. The word landed in the silence of the chamber, with the specific weight of something said, without any intent to wound, said only because it was factual. Lara felt the impact of it in her chest before her brain had processed what happened. And in that gap between impact and understanding, before any filter could kick in, she felt something that genuinely disturbed her, not anger. Not indignation. The gut-level impulse to prove him wrong. What was that? He just called me irrelevant and I want to, what? Impress him? That's insane. He's whatever he is. And I want him to see me. That makes zero sense. She swallowed all of that. Steadied her voice. Who are you? The question got a silence too long to be normal. Then, I have many names, he said. None of them matter enough to say to someone who won't be here long enough to use them. A second contempt, more elaborate. And this time Lara recognized it as it was happening, and also recognized, with a clarity that made her uncomfortable, that something in her wanted to stay precisely to prove the premise wrong. I should leave. That's clearly the rational answer. He, whatever this thing is, just told me he doesn't consider me relevant enough to give me a name. Any person with a functioning survival instinct walks out right now. She stayed. You can give me something to call you while I'm here, she said. With a coolness she didn't feel, but executed precisely. Or I can just call you the entity. Either works for me. Something crossed his face. Too fast to identify. But it crossed. Kale, he said. Use that. What he is and what she feels, that she shouldn't feel. Over the next few hours, Lara extracted fragments. Kale wasn't a demon in the Christian sense, he hadn't fallen from anything, didn't operate within the value systems that made categories like evil and good meaningful. He was older than those categories. Avasat, in the Wallachian manuscripts, poured out. Something that had overflowed into the world from a place with no name in any human language. Not because it arrived. Because it leaked. He'd been sealed in the monastery 900 years ago, by monks who devoted their lives to the ritual. Not as punishment, the concept didn't apply. As containment for something that existed outside the scale the human world could sustain without consequences. Why did they seal you? Lara asked. Because I existed, he said. Like it was obvious. What exists beyond human understanding gets automatically classified as a threat. A pause. Not because I did anything to humans. Simply because I was. Does that bother you? He looked at her with that instrument check attention, and something in that look was different from the others, not warmer, but differently positioned. Like someone recategorizing something they'd initially filed in the wrong drawer. You're asking questions that assume I have an emotional framework that can be bothered, he said. That's a premise error. It's a question about perception, not emotion. Do you perceive the situation as unjust? A longer pause. You're more precise than most, he said. Not as a compliment. As an updated data point. Lara felt the warmth of that revision in her chest and immediately clocked it with horror. I just got satisfied, because he reclassified me from irrelevant to something slightly above irrelevant. He spent 10 minutes treating me like furniture, and I'm happy because he said I ask precise questions. This is pathetic. This is exactly the kind of dynamic I analyze in medieval texts, as an example of psychological capitulation. I know better. I know better. And yet. She kept her face neutral. You should go, he said then, abruptly. Why? Because staying longer will cost you something. Me or you? The question made him pause. A fraction of a second, but she caught it, because she'd spent the last 2 years studying the details most people miss. That distinction is irrelevant, he said. But he'd answered the wrong question. Scene 7, the first trip down, and what she wrote. She hiked back down with shaky legs and a brain on fire. The audio recording had corrupted, white noise start to finish. The photos of the monastery interior existed. The photos of the chamber existed. Kale, absent from all of them. Not blurred out by light or shadow. Simply not there, like the camera had processed that space as empty. Lara stared at the photos for a long time. Then opened her notebook and wrote for 2 hours straight, the kind of writing that isn't field notes, but testimony, the attempt to convince yourself that something actually happened. On the last page of what she wrote that night, there was a list. 1. Fear, present, physical, genuine. Classification, completely justified. 2. Intellectual fascination, present. The material is exceptional. 3. Unsettled, he called me irrelevant. I should have left. I didn't. 4. More unsettled, the reason I didn't leave was not academic. 5. Attraction. After item 5, she'd written nothing. She'd stared at the word long enough for the ink to dry completely. Then written underneath it, in smaller letters. This makes no sense. He treated me like I was furniture. He said I was irrelevant. He didn't look at me once like I was a human being who mattered. And why am I? She stopped. Didn't erase anything. Closed the notebook. The next morning, she went back up. The pull, or how contempt works like a magnet. Every time he treated me like I was invisible, I wanted more desperately for him to see me. I knew it was wrong. I went back anyway. The days add up and the pattern becomes clear. Over the next 3 weeks, Lara hiked up to the monastery every single day without exception. She kept up the academic cover with a discipline that, if there'd been a witness, would have deserved some grudging respect. Systematic cataloguing of the manuscripts, organized photographs by section and approximate period, symbol transcriptions with comparative analysis. The work was real and being done with genuine quality. But there was a pattern she recorded in her notebook with the honesty of someone writing only for themselves. The time she spent in the chamber with Cale increased every day. And the work on the manuscripts, the official reason for the trip up, was consistently being pushed to the hours when the afternoon light coming through the ceiling crack made reading difficult. In other words, it was what was left after she'd spent the maximum possible time in the space where he was. She was self-aware enough to recognize this. Too far gone to change it. His behavior pattern was consistent and deeply unsettling. He didn't treat her badly in any active sense, no hostility, no deliberate cruelty. The problem was so much more sophisticated than that. He simply didn't treat her. He existed in the same space as her with the specific indifference of someone sharing a room with a piece of furniture. When he talked, and he did talk, sometimes for hours, it was about concepts. The comparative structure of dead languages. The group psychology of belief formation in isolated communities. The physics of time as experienced by entities operating on a non-human temporal scale. He spoke with the same quality of attention he'd presumably give an interesting wall, complete, precise, with zero layer of consideration for the audience. And when she said something, he listened with that instrument check attention, which registered everything, but assigned emotional weight to nothing, and responded to the content of what she'd said without any of the social signals humans use to indicate the other person matters. No, that's interesting. No validating nod. No pause that says, I'm processing what you said because you're someone who counts. Just the response. Accurate, complete, stripped of any acknowledgement that there was a person on the other end who'd said it. Lara had written 3 pages in her notebook trying to analyze the effect this had on her, and the conclusion was troubling. What he does is the exact opposite of what any healthy relationship handbook would recommend. And the effect on me is the opposite of what it should be. Instead of pushing me away, it pulls me in. Instead of making me feel like less, it makes me want more. Why? Because when he occasionally, rarely, redirects his attention to the specific content of what I said, the effect is completely out of proportion. It's like being in the dark and having a flashlight pointed at you for 1 second. That 1 second of light is more intense because of all the dark around it. I know that's what's happening. I know this is textbook intermittent reinforcement. I know it's exactly the mechanism that creates psychological dependency. And I'm here writing all this at 11 p.m., instead of sleeping because I want to go up earlier tomorrow. She closed the notebook. Slept badly. Went up earlier. The shocking moment, when he touches her for the wrong reason. On the 11th visit, something happened that Lara spent days trying to process. She was standing in the chamber, checking a manuscript passage by flashlight, when she slipped on the wet stone floor and fell. Not a bad fall, knee and palm of her hand, nothing that needed more than a cloth to clean up. But loud enough that she would have turned red from embarrassment if there'd been a human witness. There was a non-human witness. When she got up, Cale was beside her. She hadn't seen him move, she never heard him move. He was just there, looking at her with that inventory attention, his gaze dropping to the scraped palm she was holding open while she assessed the damage. He passed his fingers an inch above her palm. Without touching. Like someone testing the temperature of something they weren't sure they could make contact with. Then he said, "The scrape is superficial. It won't affect your ability to work." It was the closest thing to concern he'd shown. And it was entirely pragmatic. The concern wasn't for her. It was for the continued functionality of the research instrument. He just checked whether I can still work. Not whether I'm okay, whether I'm still functionally useful. That should make me furious. That should make me walk out. Why is it doing the opposite? Lara looked at his fingers hovering an inch above her palm, and felt something that had no adequate name in any of the 4 languages she spoke fluently. Warmth, despite the cold radiating off him. An anticipation that existed in her body before it existed in her mind. "Thanks for the medical evaluation," she said, with a dryness that gave away nothing of what she was actually feeling. He withdrew his hand. "That wasn't a medical evaluation," he said. "It was a continuity check. Your research has documentary value. You don't." The last sentence landed in the silence of the chamber like something physical. Lara stared at him for one long second. And felt, with a clarity that scared her, that the sentence had done 2 things at the same time: cracked something small somewhere in her chest, and lit something completely different right next to it. He just told me my research has value and I don't. Explicitly. No ambiguity. And why am I looking at him like this? Why isn't my first reaction anger? Why is it this impulse to make him revise that statement? This is a real problem. This is the exact kind of thing that happens to women in the texts I analyze, the ones I write about with the clinical distance of someone who knows better. I know better. I know better. And still. She left early that day. Spent 2 hours in a hot bath trying to find the rational argument that would make the impulse make sense or go away. Didn't find the argument. The impulse stayed. She went back up the next day. Trapped by the storm and what he said about her. On the 14th visit, a storm closed off the path. Lara was stuck. It was an October storm in the Carpathians, not a suggestion of bad weather but a full-on climate decision, the kind that turned the descent trail into a stream in under 20 minutes. Going down would have been genuinely dangerous. She stayed. And that night, with the candles she carried for field work and the rain hammering the stone walls, and none of the normal structure of a research visit, no notebook, no camera, no researcher shield to hide behind, something different happened. Cale talked. Not about concepts. About what 900 years in the monastery had actually been like. The texture of the silence in each season. The difference between winter and summer measured not by temperature, but by the quality of light coming through the ceiling crack. The gradual deterioration of the surrounding stone, how many millimeters per decade, what erosion feels like from the inside. He described 900 years of existence, with the neutrality of someone reporting facts about a third party. No bitterness. No self-pity. No emotional structure suggesting there was a he who suffered through any of it. And it was that, the absence of bitterness, that broke something open in Lara. Not the story itself. She'd read worse in medieval manuscripts. What broke something open was how he told it. Like someone who didn't know what they'd lost because they'd never had the vocabulary to name the loss in the first place. "How are you not angry?" she asked. "At who?" "The monks. The people who locked you in here." Anger assumes the other person had an obligation to act differently, he said. They acted according to what they were. I would have done the same thing. A pause. So do you. You catalogue what you don't understand to create the illusion of control over it. You just use words instead of stone. The mechanism is identical. That landed square in the center of her chest. That's what you think of me, she said. Not a question. That's what I observe, he corrected. What I think is different. What do you think? The silence that followed was the kind she'd learned to read, not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone who had an answer and decided not to give it. And there was something in that refusal, the first time he hadn't responded with his usual flat factuality, but had instead gone quiet deliberately, guarding something that was the most intimate thing he'd done so far. She fell asleep against the hallway wall with her pack as a pillow. When she woke up at 3 a.m. freezing, he was still in the same spot. Not sleeping. Not keeping watch. Just existing. She watched him in the dark for a while before going back to sleep. What I'm feeling right now has nothing to do with anything I'd call healthy. He called me irrelevant. He said my research has value and I don't. He's treated me like furniture for 2 weeks straight. And I'm here at 3 in the morning looking at him in the dark with my heart doing something different than its normal rhythm. What is wrong with me? Why does contempt work like a magnet instead of a repellent? It's the intermittent reinforcement. I know that's what it is. It's the unpredictability that creates dependency. I know this academically. And I can't stop. She went back to sleep. When the rain stopped and the path cleared the next morning, she hiked down. And when she got to the guesthouse door, she stopped and recognized, with a clarity she couldn't argue away. She was already counting the hours until she could go back up. The real danger, and why she stayed anyway. There was a moment in that chamber when I saw clearly that he could kill me without breaking a sweat. And the thought that came wasn't run. It was, so this is the only being who has ever been completely honest with me about what it is. The instability, real physical danger. On the 18th visit, Lara walked into the monastery and knew before she saw anything that something was wrong. The air had a different quality. Heavier, not metaphorically, physically, like the air density had shifted enough to register in her lungs before her brain caught up. The temperature had dropped way below what the weather justified. And there was a sound that lived below the hearing threshold, but above the threshold of physical sensation. She felt it in her teeth, in her chest, at the base of her spine. Cale was at the center of the containment circle, his back to the entrance. When he turned, his eyes weren't grey. They were black. Completely, absolutely black, no iris, no pupil, no border between the colored part and the white that defines a human eye. Just black with depth, like looking into something rather than at a surface. The floor around the circle had new cracks radiating from the perimeter like a spider web in broken glass. Some of them were still expanding in real time, she could see them growing, the stone giving with a sound she felt in her bones before she heard it. The wall behind him had a new vertical crack, clean and precise, like an intentional cut. The temperature was low enough now that Lara's breath came out in visible clouds. Clouds that dissolved before they dispersed normally, absorbed by something in the air she couldn't see, but could feel. "Get out," Cale said. Not a suggestion. A statement about what needed to happen. What happened? "Get out now, Lara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She'd never told him, she'd only responded to it when Marta used it, on days when Cale was present in ways she didn't fully understand. The fact that he'd stored her name, kept it, and chose to use it right now, as urgency, as weight. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't understand what you're looking at. Then explain it to me." The silence had a different texture from the others. The silence of someone using effort to maintain a shape that isn't naturally stable. "What exists inside me," he said, slowly, with a care she'd understand later, "as enormous cost isn't contained by the form you see. When I become unstable, it leaks outside that form. What leaks corrodes what's nearby. Physically." A pause during which the crack in the wall behind him visibly grew 2 inches. "You're not stone, Lara. You don't heal the way stone heals." To demonstrate the difference between what he was saying and what she was understanding, the stone directly between them, the floor between her feet, and the circle gave way. Not exploded. Gave, a slow, deliberate crack spreading from inside the circle toward her. The crack stopped about a foot from her feet. Lara looked at it. Then looked at him. And the internal fight was fierce and fast and fought in total silence, while she stood completely still. "This is real. This isn't metaphor, or hyperbole, or theater to scare me." The stone cracked. "The temperature is 20 degrees below what it was 10 minutes ago. He is telling me that what leaks out of him physically corrodes what's around it. I am what's around it. The rational answer is, get out. Right now. Immediately. The response I'm actually having is that I'm looking at him, at the all-black eyes and the posture of something fighting itself to stay contained, and what I feel isn't pure terror. It's terror and something else. Something that's in the same place as what I feel when he very rarely, very briefly looks at me like I matter. The danger and that other thing are in the same spot. What does that say about me?" She stepped forward. Not into the circle, she crossed the distance between the door and the closest point to the circle that the crack hadn't reached, and sat down on the stone floor. She didn't do anything. Didn't speak. Just stayed there, present in the same space as him. The temperature started rising. The cracks stopped spreading. It took 45 minutes. Lara felt every one of them in her body, the cold, the vibration that gradually ceased, the moment the air came back to normal density. And at no point did she consider standing up. When his eyes came back to grey, it was a process, not a switch, but a return, like something coming back from a distance that wasn't geographic. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. "Couldn't name for weeks." "Why did you stay?" he asked. And for the first time since she'd known him, the question didn't sound like analysis. It sounded like a genuine need for information. "Because you were here," she said. Like it was the simplest thing in the world. He was quiet for a long time. Then said, with his usual flatness, but with something underneath it that was different. "That was reckless." "Yeah," she agreed. "You knew the risk." "Yes." "And you stayed anyway." Not a question. A data verification. But the way he verified it, like something that shifted the classification of the subject being analyzed, made Lara feel the warmth of that revision in a way she couldn't pretend was neutral. He just reclassified me again. First I was irrelevant. Then more precise than most. Now what? Reckless. Which is more than irrelevant. Which implies there's something there to evaluate. I'm happy because I got reclassified from irrelevant to reckless. That's what happened. That's what counts. The moment she could have died. 3 days after the instability episode, Lara hiked up and found the monastery different in a way she sensed before she even got inside. No silence this time. The opposite, a sound pressure that lived below the hearing threshold, but that she felt in her ears the way you feel the milliseconds before an explosion. The air hasn't moved yet, but your body already knows it will. The exterior walls of the monastery had new cracks, not the fine fractures of stone that yields, but structural cracks wide enough to fit her hand into. She went in anyway. Which said a lot about where her self-preservation instinct was at that point. The main hallway was different. The cold was so intense that the wall joints had ice crystals on them inside the building, with no humidity source that could explain it. The floor crackled under her boots with the sound of something freezing in real time. The chamber was shut. The stone door that had always given easily was now sealed not by the original mechanism, which was destroyed, but by something else. Ice had formed along the edges, fusing the door to the frame. And from the other side, she could hear or feel, because the distinction was becoming less clear, something that had no reference point in any catalogue of sounds she knew. It was like the space on the other side of the door was being compressed. Lara put her hands on the iced-over door. Burned the cold at the temperature that burns like heat. She pulled her hands back. Stared at the door for 30 seconds. Then she shoulder-checked it open. The cold hit her like a physical impact, not temperature, but absence, the kind of thermal vacuum a body reads as violence before processing it as environmental data. She stumbled. Didn't fall, caught herself on the doorframe, which was so cold it burned through her gloves. What was in the chamber was not Cale the way she knew him. It was something larger. Not taller, the way that the form she recognized as Cale was only the visible portion of something that exceeded that outline, that existed simultaneously and clearly in the physical space of the chamber, and somewhere else that had no name. The shadow the form cast didn't correspond to the form. It was bigger, denser, and moved independently, like it belonged to a different entity. The eyes were completely black. But this time, there was something in them that the last episode hadn't had, directional depth. They weren't simply empty of expression. They were empty in a way that suggested the absence was active, not the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed light. The crack in the chamber floor had become a system. Not just fractures radiating from a point, the entire floor was split in a pattern that looked, Lara registered with the academic part of her brain still somehow functioning, like a stress fracture diagram, in a material under extreme load. The non-academic part of her brain was generating a simpler response: she could die here. Not as a figure of speech. Not as dramatic hyperbole. As a physical data point, she was sharing space with something that was actively overrunning whatever containment it had, and if the containment failed completely, she was not stone. She did not heal the way stone heals. She stood frozen in the entrance to the chamber, and had the most intense internal fight she'd had since arriving in the Carpathians. Leave? The answer is leave. There is no version of rational thought that says stay. He is unstable in a way that is structurally different from before. The floor is cracking. The temperature is low enough to cause hypothermia in under 20 minutes. And what's in that chamber, even if it's Cale, even if there's any Cale I know still available in there, is not in a position to protect me from itself. Leave? Leave right now. She stepped into the chamber. What is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? What is wrong with? She made it to the center. Not into the circle, she stopped about 6 feet from the perimeter, in the middle of the cracking system, and crouched down on the floor. Pulled off her jacket. Set it on the floor beneath her. Sat on it to create some thermal insulation between herself and the ice on the stone. And stayed. It was longer this time. 20 minutes. 30. The cold was real enough that she lost feeling in her toes inside her boots before the first half was over. Her hands went rigid. She coughed. The cold air in her lungs felt like inhaling crushed ice. She stayed. And at some point, she couldn't say when, because a sense of time had gotten imprecise along with her extremities, the compression in the air started letting go. The independent shadow was gradually reabsorbed. The temperature climbed by degrees. When his eyes came back, it was a process, not a transition, but an emergence, like something returning from a distance that wasn't physical. He saw her. Saw the jacket on the floor, her purple hands, heard her cough. And said, in the lowest register she'd ever heard from him, with something underneath, that wasn't emotion, but was the antechamber of something. You could have died. Yeah, she agreed. I know. You knew that when you came in. Yes. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Not the silence of analysis or decision, the silence of something being revised more fundamentally than the previous inventory updates. Why did you come in? He asked. Lara looked at her own purple hands while the feeling started returning to them in that particular pain of tissue rewarming. Because there's a version of you that I know somewhere inside all of that, she said. And I'm not willing to leave that version alone in there. Another silence. Longer. That's an irrational reason, he said. I know, she agreed. I came in anyway. Something moved across his face. She was learning to read the microdetails of a face that hadn't been made for human reading. And what she saw wasn't emotion. But it was the shadow of something that could have been emotion, in a different kind of being. Marta's warning and the war inside. Every woman who has ever loved what she was supposed to fear knows, reason doesn't lose to instinct because it's weaker. It loses because instinct knows the truth that reason hasn't catalogued yet. Marta tells her what she knows. That night, Marta knocked on Lara's door with 2 firm knuckle raps. She came in without waiting, closed the door, sat in the chair beside the bed with her hands clasped in her lap, and wore the expression of someone who's about to say something they know won't change anything, but feels obligated to say regardless. My mother went up once, Marta said. No preamble. When she was young. 30 years before you were born. Lara stayed quiet. The seal was still intact back then. But there were cracks, and she could feel something up there, not the thing itself. She never entered the monastery. Just the gravity of it. Like a magnetic field you can't see, but that acts on everything around you. What happened when she came back? Lara asked. She kept being who she was, Marta said. Got married, had kids. I'm one of those kids. She lived here her whole life. But there was something she never managed to do again, fully satisfy herself with what was down here. With conversations, with love, with other people being present. Marta paused. Not because she didn't love them. She did. But there was always a part of her that had stayed up there, measuring everything she received down here against what she'd felt up on the mountain. And nothing measured up. Lara sat with that for a moment. Did she describe what it felt like? She asked. What she experienced up there. Marta looked at her with an expression made of equal parts recognition and sadness. She said it was the first time she'd felt completely seen, Marta said. Not warmly. Not even kindly. But completely. Without the filter, without the editing that people do when they decide how much attention to pay you. Completely seen. A pause. And she said that was enough to make sure nothing else would ever be enough again. The silence in the room had weight. His not evil martyr continued. My mother always said that. He's not good either. He's older than those categories. The problem, she always said, isn't what he does to you. It's what you do to yourself because of what he is. What you open up that doesn't close back down. Lara stared at her own hands, still less purple than they'd been, but still aching. I hear you, she said. Marta stood up. Went to the door. Stopped. Coffee at 5 in the morning, she said. Before you go up. Not approval. Acceptance of the inevitability of things. And there was a generosity in that distinction that Lara felt more deeply than she would have felt any advice. The journal, 3 pages of internal war. Lara wrote 3 pages that night. The kind of writing that only exists when there's no audience left except yourself. What I know. 1. He called me irrelevant on day 1. Literally. Used the word. 2. He told me my research has value and I don't. 3. He treats me, most of the time, with the attention he'd give an interesting wall. 4. He is physically dangerous. Not intentionally, which in some ways is worse, because it means there's no way to negotiate. 5. He could have killed me today. I know that. Not on purpose, but because what he is doesn't fit inside the dimensions of the space we share, and when it overflows, what overflows doesn't distinguish between stone and human tissue. What I feel, that I shouldn't feel. 1. When he reclassifies me, when I move from irrelevant to imprecise, from imprecise to reckless, I feel something I have no better word for than satisfaction. A satisfaction that's way out of proportion to what actually happened. Like the pattern is, the lower the baseline of attention I get, the more valuable every millimeter above it becomes. 2. His attention, when it exists, is different from any other attention I've ever had. Not because it's warm, it isn't. Because it's complete. No filter, no selection, none of the portion of any human that's thinking about something else while they look at you. When he looks at everything. 3. Today, when I could have died, what I felt wasn't only fear. Alongside the fear there was something that looked dangerously like the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Which is psychologically problematic in ways I can articulate with great academic precision, and cannot translate into any action that involves leaving. What my brain says. This is a classic intermittent reinforcement pattern. The irregularity of the attention creates dependency. Contempt as a baseline makes every positive variation disproportionately valued. Real physical danger creates an adrenaline response that the brain frequently codes with ambiguity mixed up with states of excitement that aren't fear. I know this. I've written about this. I have cited the research on this. What my gut says. That every argument I can come up with still can't make the idea of not going back tomorrow feel more real than abstract. Provisional conclusion that is not a conclusion. There is something that happens when I'm in the same space as him that doesn't happen anywhere else. It's not safety, it's the opposite. It's not comfort, it's total discomfort, because there's no room for performance, no way to be anything other than exactly what I am, because he sees straight through anything that isn't that. And that discomfort of being completely seen even when what gets seen is classified as irrelevant, even when the attention is instrument check rather than warmth, is closer to what I understand as real than any comfort I've ever felt. That's a problem. I am going up at 5:30. The touch and what it changes. There's a twisted logic to all of it, the more he ignored me, the more I needed him to see me. The more he treated me like I didn't matter, the more I needed to prove I did. And when he finally touched me, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't not, it was worth more to me than any tenderness anyone had ever shown. The first time he gives in. It was a late afternoon in the 4th week. Lara was reading out loud. She'd started doing that in the 3rd week, reading the manuscripts to him, because she'd noticed that he knew the content, but had never heard it, only felt it in some way she didn't fully understand, and his response to hearing the texts was the only thing she'd found that slightly altered the texture of his instrument check attention into something just a little bit different. She was reading. He was listening. That was the pattern they'd settled into. This time the text was about the nature of time for entities operating on a non-human temporal scale, a 13th century treatise that argued, with impressive sophistication for the period, that what humans called eternity wasn't a bigger quantity of time, but a different quality of relationship with it. She was reading a particularly dense passage about the difference between experiencing the present as a point versus experiencing it as a field when she looked up to check if he was still listening. He was closer than she expected. The distance he always kept had disappeared. She hadn't heard him move, she never heard him move. He was less than 3 feet away, still, with those dark grey eyes on her face, and there was something in them she'd learned to recognize as the moment before an inventory revision. Lara closed the manuscript. Slow. She raised her hand. Gave him time more than enough to step back, to reposition, to do what he'd always done. He didn't step back. When her palm touched his face, it felt cold, the cold of ancient stone that holds the memory of everything that's ever touched it. And underneath the cold there was a pulse, slow and deep, that she felt in her palm like the frequency of something more fundamental than a heartbeat. He closed his eyes. That gesture, so small, so completely simple, made Lara feel the weight of everything all at once. He closed his eyes. He who never showed anything resembling vulnerability, who treated me like an inventory data point for 4 weeks, who explicitly said my research has value, and I don't, closed his eyes when I touched his face. What does that mean? I don't know how to name it. But I know it's the most honest thing I've ever watched anyone do. This changes things, she said quietly. His words returned to him. Yes, he agreed. Eyes still closed. The kind that doesn't go back. A pause. Her palm still on his face. The pulse underneath the cold. Yes, he said. And didn't step back. What exists between them, and what doesn't? The weeks that followed were the hardest to describe, not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening didn't fit into the categories she had available. His attention had changed. Not into warmth. Warmth would have required an emotional foundation that wasn't part of his structure. But it had moved out of pure instrument check into something she could call, imprecisely, directed presence. The difference between a security camera and a pair of eyes that knows what it's looking at and has chosen to look. He still didn't treat her with kindness. He hadn't learned it and showed no interest in learning. When she was wrong about something, he said so, without the social buffers humans use to make correction go down easier. When she was avoiding something, he named what she was avoiding without asking if she wanted it named. When there was a contradiction between what she said and what her behavior showed, he pointed it out with the same matter-of-factness with which he'd point out a crack in the floor. It was the most brutal honesty she'd ever experienced. And it was, she recognized this with the internal fight that had become familiar, the honesty she'd been hoping to find in human relationships and never had. There was touch now. Sparse, deliberate, always initiated by him after that afternoon, which had flipped the dynamic in a way she lay awake 2 nights trying to process. When he touched, it was specific, his hand on her face when she was exhausted but pretending not to be. his fingers along her arm, when she was reading something that affected her, and trying not to show it. The weight of his hand on her shoulder, when the silence between them asked for physical presence more than words. Always cold. Always that deep pulse. Always the effect, which she had stopped pretending was neutral, of diving into very cold water, and discovering her lungs work better than they ever have. But there was what didn't exist. No tenderness. No care that came from a place of wanting the other person to be okay. What there was instead was something else closer to, she tried to articulate, the relationship of a precision instrument with what it measures. Total attention, zero distortion, a kind of fidelity to what was actually there that was more complete than anything she'd experienced, and that existed completely independent of any emotional framework. And there was the contempt, which had never fully disappeared. It was subtler now, no longer the explicit declaration that she was irrelevant, that my research has value and I don't. But there was, in the ways he described human behavior, including hers, an implicit hierarchy that was clear. What she was and what she was capable of understanding sat several layers below what existed as his nature. Not as an insult. As a fact. But the practical emotional difference between insult and fact is, it turns out, less relevant than philosophy would suggest. And still she went up every day. And still the pull when she came down to go back, to minimize the time outside the monastery, to whatever minimum was necessary, got stronger every week. I need to be honest with myself. The contempt hasn't gone away. The hierarchy hasn't gone away. He still treats me as something that exists on a smaller scale than he does, and that's actually true in the sense that he is ancient and enormous, and I am a 27-year-old researcher from Vienna. The scale difference is real. What isn't real, what is the problem, is that it works like an aphrodisiac instead of a deterrent. What does that say about me? I don't want to know the answer. Or, I know the answer and don't want to admit it. That the complete attention of something that treats me as irrelevant is more than any relationship I've had with someone who treated me as important. Jonas arrives and shows her the mirror. Jonas Brandt arrived in Wafel Negru on a cold December day with the kind of gentle, uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who hasn't yet learned that the world has places where enthusiasm doesn't get a pass. 32. Medieval archaeology, an open face that belonged to someone who slept well at night because he wasn't at war with anything inside himself. Dr. Emmerich Brandt's nephew, sent to check if she needed support, which was the polite version of check if you're still functional enough to continue working. Lara received him at the guest house with the precise cordiality of someone who'd developed the muscle of appearing present while being entirely somewhere else. Jonas was good. Genuinely good, smart, curious, with the specific warmth of someone who grew up in a family that showed affection without strings attached. Dinner with him was pleasant. The conversation was real. He had opinions about Carolingian architecture that were interesting, and had read her articles with enough attention to ask specific questions. And Lara spent the entire dinner doing something she spent hours afterward embarrassed about, comparing. Jonas is paying attention to me. It's genuine attention, he's listening to what I say, considering it, responding to the actual content. It's the kind of attention any healthy relationship handbook would list as basic and necessary. And it feels not empty, it's not empty but filtered. Like there's a layer of social polish between what he actually perceives and what he shows me. Like what reaches me is the edited version of his real attention. That's not fair to Jonas. Jonas has no obligation to give me what Kale gives me, nobody does, because what Kale gives me isn't something humans are built to give. And I'm here comparing, and Jonas is losing the comparison without ever having had a chance to compete. This is exactly the problem Marta warned me about. This is exactly it. Jonas noticed something was different. He was perceptive enough for that. "Is there something at the monastery besides the manuscripts?" he asked, with a gentleness that made the question harder to deflect. "It's an exceptionally interesting historical site," Lara said. "Can I go up with you tomorrow?" The no was immediate. She converted it in time. "The access is tricky and I've developed a working system that doesn't hold up well with another person there." Jonas heard the no under the explanation, but didn't push. That night, Lara went to the monastery outside her normal hours for the first time. It was late, it was dark. She had promised herself she wouldn't become the kind of person who climbs mountains in the dark. She climbed anyway. And when she crossed the monastery door, she felt what she couldn't pretend she didn't feel anymore, that she was coming home. Which was the problem? The provocative scene, what he says about Jonas. When she arrived that night, Cale looked at her with the recalibrated attention that had become the new standard. Then said, "The man who arrived. You spent the afternoon with him?" "Yes. A colleague from the institute." "You find him attractive?" "Not a question. Inventory data." Lara felt heat in her face, not embarrassment, something closer to anger at being read with that kind of precision. "That's irrelevant," she said. "So it's true," Cale said. Same flat voice. "You find him attractive, and you came here anyway." "I came to work." "You came at 10 p.m., because you couldn't wait until tomorrow," he said. "That's not work." A pause. "That man can give you things I can't." The statement was factual. And yet the way it landed, not as a release, not as encouragement to go, but as a neutral data point offered with complete indifference to the outcome, did something hard to name to Lara's chest. "I know," she said. "Then why are you here?" The true answer was one she'd spent weeks refusing to fully articulate. She articulated it. "Because what he can give me isn't what I want." The silence that followed was long. "What you want," Cale said eventually, "is irrational." "Yes," she agreed. "And dangerous." "Also yes." "And you want it anyway." "Yes." Another pause. "You are," he said, "more complicated than my initial cataloging suggested." It was the biggest revision he'd made in all the time they'd known each other. And Lara felt the disproportionate impact of it, of being moved from irrelevant to complicated, of having her value in his perception migrate from zero to something that required a new category, with full awareness of how disproportionate the impact was and total inability to moderate what she felt. "He just called me complicated like it's an insult. And my heart is in my throat like it's a compliment. That's what happened to me. I know it's a problem. I know any therapist I described this to would say it's a dependency pattern built on intermittent reinforcement combined with extreme power imbalance. I know all of that. And it's still the most important thing anyone has said to me in years." The boundary scene, heated, charged, real. There were things the body understood before the mind had words for them. And there were things the mind would never have words for because they existed in a register words can't reach. The night the distance ended. She was the one who crossed the line. And she did it with the clarity of someone making a choice, not someone being swept along by an impulse, which made it more complicated, not less. It was a Thursday in December, genuinely cold in the Carpathians, and she'd stayed later than usual because the manuscript she was translating had hit a particularly difficult section, and she'd lost track of time. When she finally looked up, the chamber was dark with the specific darkness of mountain night, not city dark, which always has some light pollution somewhere, but total darkness that makes the space feel simultaneously smaller and more intimate. Cale was in his usual spot. She walked toward him. Not dramatically. She just got up from where she'd been sitting and crossed the chamber, until she was close enough that his cold was the first thing she felt before anything else. "Lara," he said. The warning was in his voice, present but not forced. "I know," she said. "You don't know everything that." "I know enough," she said. Not with impatience. With the calm of someone who's been arriving at a conclusion for weeks. "I know you can hurt me. I know what exists here doesn't have a name in any language I speak. I know it's going to cost things I can't predict." She looked at him directly. "And I know it's what I want." A long silence. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, her wrist, in places she didn't normally notice her heartbeat. He raised his hand and ran his fingers along her face. Along her jaw, down her neck, stopping there with a pressure that was presence more than force. Cold palm and that deep pulse she felt transmitted through the contact. "What you want," he said, in a register lower than his usual, "is something I don't know if I can give you the way you're used to receiving it. Then give it to me the way you can." His eyes shifted. Not to the black of the instability episodes, a deepening of the dark grey, like ocean that gets darker as it gets deeper, without ever losing the quality of being something you could move through, if you knew how. He pulled her closer. Not roughly, with the same deliberateness that characterized every movement he made, each one a decision fully weighed before being executed. What followed wasn't like anything she'd imagined in the moments she'd let herself imagine it, which were more than she'd admit. It was cold at first, his temperature much lower than hers, and there was that pulse, closer now, transmitted through physical contact, that she felt in her chest like the low frequency of a bass string. The cold started giving not because he warmed up, but because something between them began operating on a frequency that sat between their two temperatures, finding the common calibration point after long enough proximity. She closed her hands in the fabric of his shirt and felt underneath it not muscle, but something with a different consistency, denser, more permanent, the kind of solidity that's structural rather than earned. Like holding stone that has a body temperature. He stopped before she did. Pulled back a few inches with his usual precision, eyes darker than she'd seen them, wearing an expression she could read now, cost. The expression of someone holding back something they'd rather not hold back, because holding back is the right thing to do. "No more," he said. "Low? Not tonight." "Why?" "Because what starts doesn't stop. And you need to choose this with full awareness, not in the middle of the night in a place where there's nothing else around." She wanted to argue. Recognized he was right and hated it. "And tomorrow?" she asked. Something on his face, very small, very brief, was his equivalent of a smile, translated into the language of a being that wasn't built for smiling. "Tomorrow you go back down, sleep, have coffee with Marta. And if you still want to come up after that, come up." He is being the adult in this situation. That's shocking. He who has no emotions in any way I understand, who called me irrelevant, who said my research has value and I don't, is being the adult here. Asking me to choose with full awareness. What does it say about me that no human I've loved ever did that? She went up the next morning. She always went up. What is possible between them, and what it costs. What developed over the weeks after that was something Lara had stopped trying to name, because every name she found shrank it instead of capturing it. There was intimacy, but not the kind built from gradual revelations and shared vulnerabilities. It was the intimacy of two existences that had learned to inhabit the same space in a way that changed the space when either one was missing. The chamber felt smaller when she was alone working on manuscripts. It felt like it had different proportions when he was there. There was touch, which had developed in ways she couldn't describe to anyone without sounding either naive or too clinical, both at the same time, irreconcilable. It was physical and not entirely physical. It was communication in a register below language, more fundamental than symbol or word, the kind of exchange that happens when two systems learn each other's frequency. And there was what he was, which hadn't changed. He still treated her with an implicit hierarchy she'd stopped pretending didn't exist. There was still, in the ways he described the world, a scale where what she was sat several levels below what he was, not out of cruelty, but as a fact, as matter of fact, as the temperature difference between them. There were still moments when he looked at her with instrument-check attention instead of directed presence, and in those moments she felt the difference like temperature, like going from inside to outside in the winter. The contempt was still there. More subtle now, more built into the structures than stated outright. But present. And there was still, and this was the center of the problem, the knot she'd stopped trying to untie, the fact that contempt worked on her the same as before, not as a repellent. As a magnet. I spent 12 years being educated to recognize this as pathology. I read the studies. I wrote about the mechanisms. And here I am living what I analyzed, knowing what it is, unable to identify any argument that would make stopping feel more real than continuing. Because, and this is the part one can't put in academic language without it sounding like surrender, what exists here, even with the contempt, even with the hierarchy, even with the real physical danger, is more real than anything that existed before. And I don't know if the realness I feel is produced by the mechanism, or if the mechanism exists, because there was always a part of me that knew what it needed and had never found it. I don't know. I don't know, and I keep going. The cost, which she knew and paid anyway. He told me to go. I knew he was right. I went. And I came back. Because right was never enough against what existed when I was there. What gets lost? The problem with being calibrated to a different frequency is that your original frequency stops being enough. Lara caught this in the accumulation of small data points over the weeks. The calls with colleagues in Vienna that had always been satisfying started requiring conscious effort to seem present for. The conversations with Jonas, who stayed in the village for 10 days, genuinely trying to be useful, happened with Lara fully present on the surface and entirely absent underneath. Something she could sustain, because she'd become an expert in surface presence years ago. The colors of Varfel Negru seemed less saturated when she came down from the mountain. Not dramatically, more like the difference between a high-resolution photo and a standard one. Same image, less information per square inch. And there were the dreams. She'd started dreaming about the chamber every night. Not with anxiety, with the familiarity of a known place. And she woke from those dreams more rested than any sleep had produced before, and with a longing that lasted until the moment she crossed the monastery threshold. Marta looked at her in the mornings and sometimes said things that were warnings wrapped in observations. My mother used to look like that, she said one morning. At things down here. Like they were copies of something real instead of the actual thing. Lara didn't answer. Drank her coffee slower than usual, staring at the mountain through the kitchen window. The process was happening. She recognized it. She knew its clinical name. She understood the mechanisms. She went up anyway. The shocking moment, when he tells her the whole truth. On a January afternoon, Cale said something Lara spent a week processing. They were in silence, the silence that had become their usual, full rather than empty, when he said, without any lead-in, with his usual flat factuality. You're destroying yourself. Lara looked up from the manuscript. Explain. What you are, he said, requires the world you built down there to function within its own framework. The work, the people, the reference points. A pause. You're losing them. Not visibly yet. But you are. And it will keep happening the longer you're here. You're telling me to leave. I'm describing what's happening. That's different from telling me to leave. Telling you to leave would imply I have a preference about the outcome, he said. Describing it, I'm giving you the information to make your own choice. Lara was quiet for a moment. And if I choose to stay, then what's happening will keep happening. A pause. And eventually you won't be able to fully function in the world that's yours. Not acutely, gradually. You'll still be able to go to conferences, publish, have conversations. But you'll be doing all of it with a piece of you that stayed here, measuring everything down there against what's up here, and nothing will measure up. It was the exact description of what had happened to Marta's mother. Does that matter to you? She asked. The silence was longer than any before it. What I experience in relation to your state, he said, with a precision that seemed to cost something, is different from mattering in the sense you use. But it's also different from indifference. A pause. I don't have a better word than, I would prefer that you continue being what you are. It was the closest thing to care he'd ever expressed. Delivered with the flatness of a data point. But it was care. He just told me he would prefer that I continue being what I am. Using the word prefer, which implies relative value, which implies there's an option that's better than another for him. And he said this while describing how I'm destroying myself by being close to him. This is how do I process this? He's telling me he cares about my well-being while admitting that what he is corrodes me. And the conclusion he draws is that I should leave. And the conclusion I draw is that someone finally said they'd prefer me to keep being who I am, and I don't want to go anywhere. The decision to go, and why it's the hardest thing. She went. Not because she wanted to. Because she understood he was right, and recognizing he was right was one of the few things she could still do consistently. The conversation where he told her to go was long. Not because he argued much, he never argued, only described. But because she needed time to ask the question she'd been avoiding. What happens to you if I go? What always has, he said. I exist. Alone. Alone implies there's a category of not alone that would be the preferred state. I don't have that reference point. It was the answer she'd expected. And then she said something she hadn't planned. You're going to have it now. The silence after that was the heaviest of all. Cale looked at her for a long time. And said, That's cruel. The word surprised her. He never used morally loaded language, he was older than moral categories. Why? She asked. Because you're giving me something I didn't know I could have and then telling me you're leaving. A pause. That's the kind of thing humans do to each other when they want to cause pain. I'm not leaving forever, Lara said. I'm going to verify that I can still exist down there. And then I'm coming back. You can't know that. You can't know that I won't. A different silence. The silence of something being weighed in real time. Go, he said. And if you can come back, come back. It was the most complete concession he had ever made. The world down there, and why it doesn't work the same way anymore. Vienna hadn't changed. I had changed. And the difference between those two things was that Vienna was never going to know what to do with who I'd become. Back. Vienna in February was exactly what it had always been, orderly, precisely cold in the meteorological sense, beautiful in the way that good architecture is beautiful, with admiration that doesn't require personal investment. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The plant alive, the manuscript bookmarked at the page where she'd stopped, the organizational system she'd spent years optimizing and had always thought of as evidence that she could create order in her own space. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Went in. closed the door, and felt the absence of the monastery with a physical precision she hadn't expected, in her bones, in the texture of the air that was climatically identical to the chamber, but felt completely different, in the quality of the silence that was empty instead of full. She stood in the middle of the living room. Then she went to work. The next 3 months were what she'd describe later as the process of learning to exist on 2 frequencies at the same time. The Vienna frequency worked. The work kept being good, she had professional pride that was entirely hers, that no experience had altered. The Carpathian manuscript article got accepted by a top publication. Conferences happened. Conversations with colleagues happened. Everything happened with that extra layer of effort she'd noticed on the flight back. Not unsustainable but present. Like operating a system that normally runs on autopilot, which suddenly requires conscious attention for every step. And there were the dreams. Every night, the chamber. Waking up more rested than any sleep had ever produced. And the longing that lasted until she remembered where she was and then lasted differently, like weight instead of urgency. Jonas's attempt, and why it fails in a way that isn't his fault. Jonas had returned to Vienna the same week as her. And with the specific gentleness of someone raised to be gentle, he'd created occasions for them to run into each other. She showed up. Not because she wanted to, because she needed to verify she still could. And she could, on the surface, which had always been enough before. One of those evenings, over wine and conversation about a colloquium they'd both attended, Jonas said something that stayed with her. "You came back different." "How so?" "I can't describe it exactly. More present, maybe. But also more absent. Like there's more of you here than before, but less of her is available." He paused. "Can I ask what happened in the Carpathians?" She looked at him for a moment. "I found something that changed the scale of my reference points," she said. Which was the truest and least explainable version at the same time. In terms of research. In terms of existing. Jonas was quiet for a moment. "Can I try to be something at that scale?" he asked. With the honesty of someone asking a question they are afraid of the answer to. Lara looked at him. With genuine warmth. With the sadness of someone about to be honest in a way that will hurt someone who doesn't deserve to be hurt. "No," she said. "Not because there's anything wrong with you. But because what changed my scale isn't something that can be replicated. It is what it is." Jonas nodded with the expression of someone who understood more than was said. "You're going back," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Be careful," he said. Not as a warning about physical danger. As an acknowledgement that there were forms of danger he didn't fully understand but that were real. It was the most complete act of care anyone had shown her in months. And she felt for him, in that moment, a genuine warmth that she knew wasn't enough. The return, the most deliberate choice. "I went back in May. With my eyes completely open to what I was doing and what it would cost. And I went anyway. Not because I didn't know. Because I knew, and it was still true." May in the Carpathians, the climb back. It was May when Lara hiked the mountain again. The snow had melted, the path was clear, and there were birds all the way up to the altitude where they always stopped, and Lara stopped there too, listened to the limit of the sound, and then walked into the silence with the step of someone coming home. The monastery was the same. The cracks had grown over the winter but the structure held. The door still open. She went straight to the chamber. Stood at the center inside the containment circle, crossing the perimeter, with the same deliberateness, with which she'd crossed every other relevant boundary, and went still. And said, "Kale." The silence held. Long enough that she felt the weight of a possibility she hadn't considered with enough honesty, that he might not be there anymore. That the winter, without the seal, in a growing state of instability, might have cost something. Then the shadow thickened. Slower than the other times. Like something weighing every millimeter of the process. The form took shape gradually, and when those dark grey eyes found hers, there was something in them she'd seen only once before, that deepening that wasn't emotion, but was the anteroom of something. "You came back," he said. With a tone she'd learned to read, the weight of something that matters. "I came back," she said. "You verified?" "Yes. I can still exist down there. It's harder than it was before. But I can. And you came back anyway." "And I came back anyway." A silence. He didn't move. Neither did she. "Why?" he asked. And this time it didn't sound like analysis. It was the question of someone who needed information they couldn't derive from any other available data. Lara thought about the honest answer. Not the pretty one, not the one that would make sense to someone on the outside, not the one she could put in any article she'd ever write. "Because I found out," she said, "that I would rather exist here, with everything that costs, than exist down there with all the comfort that offers. Not because down there is bad. Because here is more real." A pause. "And because you said you'd prefer that I keep being what I am. And nobody had ever said that before. Not the way you said it, with nothing else behind it." The silence that followed had a texture she recognized, something being decided in real time. Cale crossed the space between them. For the first time, he was the one who crossed. Without her moving. Without her closing the distance. He walked across the chamber, and stopped in front of her close enough that his cold was the first thing she felt. And said, in a voice lower and more deliberate than anything he'd said before. "Then stay." Not as a concession. As a choice. "What happens when you stay?" "I stayed. And I learned that staying isn't the end of the story. It's where the hardest story begins." The first full winter together, what he never lets her forget. Lara made her arrangement with Varfel Negru more permanent in June, with an explanation to the Institute that was true enough to be accepted. The Carpathian material was rich enough to justify long-term research. Emmerich Brandt was pragmatic enough to accept results without asking too many questions about the process. Marta gave her a better room. No commentary. The dynamic with Cale changed not radically, not in the way she'd imagined when she'd let herself imagine this phase. It changed the way things change when what was temporary becomes permanent, with more weight in each detail, because details are no longer episodic, but constitutive. The contempt hadn't ended. She had to be honest about that. There were days when he looked at her with instrument-check attention, without the directed presence she'd learned to recognize as his version of something close to affection, and those days had a cold that wasn't about the temperature. There were moments when he described something about human behavior, with an implicit hierarchy that included her as an example, not an exception. There was the consistent way he reminded her of the scale difference between them, not cruelly, but factually in ways she couldn't fully immunize herself to. And there was her own reaction to that, which she'd stopped trying to fix. When he looked at her with instrument-check attention and she felt that cold, there was an impulse, which she recognized as problematic and felt anyway, to do something that would shift the attention. To be more precise, more interesting, more something that would move her classification in his inventory. In other words, the original pattern, just more sophisticated, the pursuit of approval from someone who made approval rare enough to be desirable. "I know what this is. I know the technical name, the mechanism, the literature. And still, when he looks at me with instrument check attention and then shifts to directed presence, the effect is so out of proportion I can't even pretend it's neutral. The variation that should be trivial is the most important thing that's happened all day. And I know this is exactly the mechanism I would have analyzed in anyone else with clinical detachment from a safe distance. I am not at a safe distance. And clinical detachment doesn't survive being inside it. There was also what was good. Which was different from good in the conventional sense. It was the complete presence of something that existed without a filter, without the constant self-editing humans do in society. There was the honesty that never spared her but also never diminished her beyond what was factually true. There was the attention, when it existed, that had become the standard against which she measured everything else without being able to stop. And there was the fact, which she'd accepted in a way that didn't require analysis anymore, that what existed between them, with all its asymmetries and costs and impossible parts, was more real than anything else she'd ever experienced. Which didn't make it easier. Only truer. The moment she almost left for real. There was a moment, in the fall of the first full year, when she almost left for good. Not from fear, not from physical danger. From something harder to name, a day when he'd been completely in instrument check mode for hours, looking through her instead of at her, responding to her questions with the bare minimum, treating the shared space as if she were an element of the room's background, and she'd felt that specific cold that wasn't about temperature for so long in a row that she'd hit a saturation point. She'd left the chamber without saying anything. Hiked down. Gone to her room at the guest house. Sat on the bed for a long time. This is what it is. This is not going to change, because it's not something he's doing, it's what he is. There is no version of Cale that treats me consistently as anything above an inventory data point. The version that sees me, when it exists, is real. But it's an exception that emerges from something that, by nature, treats the world as an object of observation rather than a relationship. And I can keep living with this, I know I can. I've proved I can, but I need to ask whether I want to. Can I want a life where how I feel on any given day depends on the variation in attention from a being that has no structure for emotional consistency? Can I want that? Or am I confusing the intensity of what I feel for an argument to keep going? She sat in the room for 4 hours. Marta brought tea without asking why. And then she went back up. Not because she'd arrived at a rational conclusion, but because she'd arrived at one more fundamental than rational, that the life that existed in that monastery was the life she wanted, with all its asymmetries and costs and days of cold that wasn't temperature. And because she'd discovered, in those 4 hours in the room, that the alternative, the life without it, was an abstraction with the right dimensions, but no substance she could actually feel as real. What Cale does that she didn't expect. She went back up. Returned to the chamber. He was there. Not in instrument check mode in the other one, the directed presence, the one she'd learned to recognize as his version of something close to affection. And he said, "You were down there longer than usual." "Yes. Because of this morning." Not a question. "Yes," she said. A silence. And then he said something she hadn't expected. "There are days when what exists inside me takes up more of the space I have," he said. "On those days I can't," he said, and stopped. Tried again. "It's not intention." It was the closest thing to an apology structurally possible for something that had no emotional framework for the concept of apology. Lara was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know it's not intention." A pause. "But it still costs something." "I know," he said. And the way he said it, with the specific weight of new information being integrated into the inventory, was different from the other times he'd said the same thing. It was different because this time, there was something in it that was close to what humans call awareness of effect on another person. Not empathy. Not remorse. But something. And that nameless something, that first movement toward a category he hadn't been built for was, to Lara, more than any declaration of love from any human had ever been. What stays? There's no happy ending here in the way happy endings are usually understood. There's something better, truth. And truth, I've learned, is the only kind of love that never had to lie to exist. 1 year later. Lara Voss is still in Varfel Negru. She publishes research, good research, recognized and cited. Nobody in academia understands why a researcher with her credentials chose to settle in a remote Romanian village, but nobody questions the results either. The institute keeps the funding. The work on the monastery manuscripts is producing material that will keep researchers busy for decades. Marta stopped trying to talk her into anything. She leaves coffee at 5 in the morning every day, even on days when Lara doesn't go up. It's a kind of quiet care that Lara has learned to receive without turning it into analysis. Jonas sends occasional emails. She writes back. The distance between them is friendly and honest, the kind that settles between two people who recognized, without drama, that they exist on frequencies that don't fully overlap. What exists between her and Kale has no name. She stopped looking for one. There are still days when he looks at her with instrument check attention, and she feels the cold that isn't temperature. The implicit hierarchy is still there, the scale difference that is factual, and doesn't disappear just because she decided to stay. The contempt is still there, subtler, more built into the structures than stated outright. And her reaction to it is still what it was, which she stopped trying to fix. And there is the directed attention, when it exists. The honesty that never spares her. The sparse and deliberate touch that she'd learned to read as the language of something that wasn't built for language, but was trying anyway. The deep pulse underneath the cold that she felt as the frequency of something that had existed before anything she knew and that had, in some way that neither of them had the structure to fully name, found in her a reference point that altered how it existed. She had a journal she'd started on the first night in Varfel Negru, and kept writing in. In the last entry, she'd written, "Today he looked at me with instrument check attention for 3 hours, and I felt the cold and the impulse to do something that would shift the classification. And then he said, with no traceable reason, that what I'd said yesterday about the temporal structure of the Varsat entities had been the most precise articulation he'd heard from a human on that concept. And what I felt was out of proportion. It was a minimal upgrade, literally from less precise to more precise. And it was the most important thing that happened all day. I know that's the pattern. I know its name, its mechanism, why it works. And I know, from having analyzed that mechanism in medieval texts for years, that the women I studied knew too or felt, without the words, the functional equivalent of knowing. And they stayed anyway. And today, after a year, I understand something I didn't understand when I was only a researcher, and not a participant, that knowing isn't the same as being able to stop. Not because knowing is insufficient, it's enough to describe. But describing isn't feeling, and what you feel doesn't obey description. He's not human. He doesn't have a soul in any way the word implies. He called me irrelevant. He told me my research has value and I don't. He treated me like furniture for weeks. He could kill me without meaning to, just by being what he is on his bad days. And I would burn the whole world down for him. Not because I am weak. Because I finally know what it is to want something with every single part of who I am, without the internal split I used to call autonomy when it was actually just protection. Because I was finally completely seen even when what got seen was classified as irrelevant, even when the attention was instrument check rather than warmth. and that total visibility is the only mirror in which I've fully recognized what's actually there. This isn't a conclusion. It's just what is, while it is. The end. Author's final note. This story is not a manual. It's not an argument that love that hurts is love worth having. It's not a celebration of contempt as attraction. It's a map of territory that exists, that has always existed, in the medieval texts Lara studied, and in the lives of the people who wrote them, and that most of us would rather not name, because naming it feels like endorsing it. What Lara's story describes isn't simple pathology. It's the real tension between what we know should satisfy us and what actually does. Between the brain that maps the terrain correctly and the gut that inhabits the terrain regardless of the map. There is no fix for that tension. There is only the choice of how to exist inside it. Lara chose to exist inside it with her eyes open. That's the only kind of choice that deserves the name.